Morning, everybody. I think we've just gone live on our webinar this morning, working with dot credits. I see we have 99 participants, so it's 100 now, but we have over 600 people have registered. So we will, there's only a whole load coming there, but we will just wait a few minutes to get those people to join us. The numbers clicking up there. So yeah, this of all our webinars, this is the one that has the biggest registration. We've actually had to close it at one point. Just to let you know, we are recording this, so we will be able to send it out to all the registrants, the recording afterwards, after the event. Feel free to use the chat box, as people are already doing that. Let us know where you're coming from. But actually, Roxanne, we might as well put the first poll up there while we wait to see where people are joining us from. We did have somebody from Oceania the other week. This is the fourth of our webinars related to CDCS, and we're joined by Gary Collyer. I'll introduce him properly in a minute. So a lot of people from Europe, as you would expect, early in the morning. You can see there's a few people that know you out there, Gary. You being the legend of dot credits, a big draw for us. I tried to sort of explain to people what it's like, you know, having someone like yourself speaking on these things, in the context of, you know, how well known you are within the trade community. So thanks so much for giving up your time today. So we've got Asia. We expect we've got a lot of people joining us from China and Korea, India. Nobody from the Americas. We've got one person from Oceania. Thank you. Late in the day there. Maybe the people from Americas might join us a bit later because it is kind of early there. 3 o'clock if you're in New York. But of course they can see the recording. So we're up to 178. So that, Gary, gives you the kind of split of where people are coming from, Europe, Asia, some people from Africa, and interestingly enough, Gary and I were talking before. Gary and I have done some work at different times in Nigeria, so we know that market as well. So, Roxanne, can we go to the next poll, please? Just to quickly, that one just tells people to find out where kind of roles they're in. My guess is that a lot of people are in from the ops side because of the subject matter today. Somebody from France and Hamburg there, very good. Yeah, we've got somebody coming from London as well. There you go. So, yeah, and so I just want to know what kind of roles you're in. I'm presuming a lot of ops. Yeah, there you go. Gary, that gives you a kind of a split as to where they are. Thanks very much. You know, 233, so we've already got more participants than we have ever had on one of these things, and still going along. So we'll get in onto that. So thanks very much. My name's Alec. Thanks, Roxanne. We can close that. Just give an idea of where everybody's coming from, and feel free to use the chat for any questions you may have, and we'll answer them at the end. And if we don't have time, we will go back to you with an email. Good morning. My name is Alex Gray, Head of Trade and Transaction Banking here at LIBF, the London Institute of Banking and Finance. And the idea of doing these webinars is to give people a flavour of our qualifications, and they're all done by experts in the field. And we're very lucky today to have Gary Collyer, Managing Director of Collyer Consulting and the CDCS course editor. So very much a key person. Gary and I used to work together at HSBC. Over 20 years ago, so we haven't seen each other for a while. We're both looking slightly different. And for people who've been joining these webinars, you can see I'm now wearing glasses. So in the space of the lockdown, my eyesight's deteriorated. I've been stuck at a computer all the time. But for those who are looking for CPD points, you can get CPD points. We have your name and register, and you use that to send a screenshot in, and we will be able to use that for your recertification. So we'll come back to me with a Q&A, but Gary, thanks so much for joining us this morning, and over to you.
Thank you, Alex. Good morning and good afternoon, everybody. Looking at the chat box and where everybody's coming from, I think we've got probably nearly every country in the world at the moment, certainly every continent. Thank you for joining. This session is on two levels, really. One is really sort of to cover some of the aspects which are encompassed within the Guide to Documentary Credits, the syllabus book for the CDCS, as well as some issues in relation to, what do we actually do on a day-to-day basis in relation to LCs? And I think that's the way I approached it when I revised the 5th edition of the Guide to Documentary Credits, that we really needed to try and put something into a book that was an A to Z of the process, in order that you could actually use it at those two levels. One, to ease your way through the examination process, hopefully, and secondly, that it would become a useful tool in relation to your day-to-day activities within your own organizations. And hopefully that process has achieved that. We are on a limited amount of time this morning for such a topic as this. As you know, we could talk for probably days on documentary credit. So this is really going to be an overview of an overview almost, in trying to get through a few messages to you. But what I've put together for this particular webinar are really some of the facets from the Guide to Documentary Credits booklet, i.e. the pre-issuance considerations and requirements, the issuance process, some features and types of documentary credits, the examination process itself, honour or negotiate or to refuse, and finally financing. So in effect, this is the 6 key levels of this A to Z that I mentioned at the beginning. When we look at pre-issuance considerations and requirements, I think a lot of people don't really pay as much attention to this aspect of the process as they do to the issuance and everything that follows afterwards. But the reality is, if you don't get this correct at this particular stage, then you're going to have problems later on. The problems will either be at the point of issuance, at the point of examination, because something is wrong in the actual transaction. So this has a very key role to play in the overall transaction. When we look at some of the couple of bullet points at the beginning, obviously these are clear mandates for each individual organisation. The need for due diligence processes on the applicant and the beneficiary, the maintaining of a credit facility in order for the issuing bank to issue that particular letter of credit. But the next 3 bullet points are very important in how we frame and structure any letter of credit. From an applicant and beneficiary viewpoint, it's extremely important, in my view, that the sales contract, the pro forma invoice, purchase order, whatever is the basis for the issuance of the LC, provides some descriptive detail. By descriptive detail, I'm talking about what is the routing, what types of documents are to be called for, a description of the goods which outlines in precise terms and in concise as well terms the reality of what that description is. There's no point having a description of goods which is 20 lines long. That serves no purpose whatsoever. What protects an applicant are the actual documents that you call for, and who issues those documents, and what the content of those documents are to be. And that's why I say you have a descriptive sales contract or pro forma invoice, etc. That it lists out what kind of data we're looking for, who's going to issue this document, and how is it going to be framed in a letter of credit. One of the big issues that we have today is that probably in 70 or 80% of the LCs that we issue today, the wrong transport document is being issued. Invariably, applicants and beneficiaries will come together and they will agree on terms, the more common Incoterms of FOB, CFR, CIF. Whereas the reality is that those 3 Incoterms are really not appropriate for containerized shipments, which is really what the bulk of letter of credit business is about today. Yes, those 3 Incoterms work for commodity transactions, but they do not work in relation to the underlying shipments that are made by containerized methods, whereby the goods are actually not delivered on board the vessel, they're delivered to a forwarding agent at the premises of the beneficiary, or they're delivered to a container terminal or a container yard for them to be transported to the vessel as and when those goods are going to be shipped. So selecting the correct Incoterm actually drives what type of document should be called for in relation to the transport. And when we look today, most LCs are issued today calling for bills of lading, when the reality is it should be a multimodal transport document. And the reality is that that's what you get. If you call for a bill of lading, what you are receiving is a multimodal transport document, because it will indicate a place of receipt and or a place of final destination. Lastly, it's a responsibility, I believe, of issuing banks to provide a suitable documentary credit application form. The only protection that an applicant gets in relation to any letter of credit that's issued today is through the documents which are presented under that letter of credit. And if that applicant is not afforded the opportunity to provide some detailed information regarding the data content for certain documents, then that right is being denied of them. You can take a very simple document as a packing list. How many banks have a letter of credit application form that just says packing list in, and then there's a gap, and it will say copies. And all the beneficiary is required to do or expected to do is insert a number into that field. But the reality is, to a large number of applicants, that packing list has real intrinsic value. And that value is down to what's in each box, how it's packed, where can I find certain items of goods that I've ordered. All those kinds of things are important to an applicant. And the reality is, if that's not being afforded to them, a beneficiary, and here we're looking at a flip side almost, a beneficiary could simply issue a document where the credit says packing list in, let's say, 3 copies. That beneficiary could issue a document that says it's a packing list and say, all the goods covered by my invoice number 1 are packed in container number ABCD 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And that's a packing list. But does that serve the purpose of the applicant? Does that serve the reason why the applicant put a cross in that box for a packing list? Is that what the applicant was expecting? The reality is, why was there not space for the applicant to expand upon that? Because one of the key features of the UCP, as you'll all be aware, is Article 14F. Article 14F of UCP, in anybody's language, is a penalty clause. It's a penalty clause to every single applicant and issuing bank. Because what it's saying is, if you don't name the issuer, that document can be issued by anybody. If you don't say the data content, any data can be included within that document, providing it's not in conflict with the credit or with any data on any other document. Why is that article in the UCP? It's there because banks' LC application forms do not provide suitable mechanisms for an applicant to include a reference to who is to issue a certain document and what data content is to appear on it. So there is a responsibility at 2 levels here before we even start the LC process. The applicant and beneficiary in relation to formulating the terms and conditions, and in relation to the issuing bank providing a suitable documentary credit application form. Moving on to the issuance process itself, we look at the selection or identification of an advising or confirming bank. This obviously to a large degree will be down to the correspondent banking relationships which would exist between the issuing bank and certain banks. However, as we all know, there are ways and means of getting a credit to a certain bank, even if the issuing bank is not in direct correspondent relationship with a bank that's been advised to it by the applicant or the beneficiary. It will be done by routing through another bank. Expiry date, latest shipment date, and presentation period are compatible. Even as recent as a couple of days ago, I received a copy of an LC sent to me, and somebody asked me the question, is this good issuance? The expiry date was the 31st of August, latest shipment date was the 30th of June, and presentation period was 21 days after dates of bills of lading. The reality here is it doesn't make much sense, because effectively, the beneficiary can only present documents up until the 21st of July. The rationale behind why the expiry date is for a further 6 weeks was unknown to the nominated bank who asked the question, but clearly there are issues as to why it was issued in that way, and clearly banks should look at trying to align these 3 dates so that they are all compatible with each other. The description of goods or services meet local regulatory requirements. You know, as you may have noticed in the guide to documentary credit publication, you know, there is a few chapters now on the regulatory aspects and the requirements for that. And one of those is description of goods. What we find is that, you know, a lot of regulatory authorities do not like letters of credit issues just saying equipment or spares even, that they require a bigger description or a more descriptive description of what exactly is that equipment, what is it being used for, and what type of equipment is it. Clearly, you know, a lot of regulators are concerned about dual purpose goods, and therefore, you know, anything, you know, if you said you're doing a shipment of pipes, you know, are these pipes potentially usable as a projectile or a means of firing a projectile, that kind of thing. But again, the description of goods or services that meet local regulatory requirements is also linked to having a description which is commensurate to the credit. You know, I've always said in the sessions that I've held, if you have 2 examples of a letter of credit, and these 2 letters of credit are exactly the same in their terminology, the documents that are required, expiry dates, etc., amounts, but one of those LCs says in the goods description, 1,000 spare parts for washing machines, as per pro forma invoice number 1. And the other LC says 1,000 spare parts for washing machines, as per pro forma invoice number 2, and lists out all 1,000 items. Is there any benefit between one of those to the other? And the answer is clearly no, not at all. The fact that an invoice may be required to and does list out 1,000 individual items of spare parts does not mean that those 1,000 spare parts have been shipped, or that the 1,000 spare parts that have been shipped are the ones that were listed under pro forma invoice number 2. Where the protection for goods shipped is afforded under a letter of credit is in the documents that are called for. Having independent inspection documentation, independent analysis documentation, that's where the protection lies, and that's really where the issues are in relation to goods descriptions. Having a list of documents that are commensurate to the goods to be shipped. You know, this can be very, very simple. You know, I saw recently a letter of credit covering a shipment in bulk of wheat. So basically it's just dumped into the hold of a vessel. This credit asks for a packing list. Now, what is the purpose of a packing list when the wheat is being shipped in bulk? But the beneficiary was required to issue it, and they issued it, and what did they say? Packing list, goods shipped in bulk. What was the purpose of asking them to do it, and what was the purpose or benefit of having that particular document? I've already mentioned that documents where appropriate should indicate an issuer and the data content. This is where, if you are an issuing bank, that you are providing a service to your customer and offering them a level of protection. Because not having an issuer allows anybody, including the beneficiary, and data content, as you are aware, allows for any data content to be afforded on that document, even to the extent, as mentioned in ISBP 745, that the goods could say, you know, these goods are not fit for human consumption. So are you really doing a service to your customer when a credit is issued just saying inspection certificate? To my mind, if a credit is issued just saying inspection certificate in one original, it's a complete waste of time. Absolutely waste of time. There has to be more to it. There has to be more detail. Finally, there has to be appropriate settlement and reimbursement conditions. One of the slides that we're going to look at a little bit later is the issue of honour and negotiation, because even today, a lot of people have a lot of confusion over honour or negotiation and what it means, and in particular, negotiation. And in relation to negotiation, what type of reimbursement condition should be applied to that particular type of transaction. So when we start talking about features and types of documentary credits, I pulled out here a few extras over and above the normal standard commercial type letter of credit. If you look at revolving letters of credit, I've seen credits issued that have just said this credit is revolving 5 times. That's not good enough. In a revolving letter of credit, there has to be 3 criteria. 1, is the revolving automatic or non-automatic? Is the revolving to occur on a cumulative, i.e. any unused balance is carried forward, or non-cumulative basis, in which case that any balance from before is effectively lost? And lastly, the basis for that. Is it every month? Is it after each shipment? On what basis is it to be done? It is not just sufficient to include a reference to something being revolving. Similarly, for a reinstatement credit, if you're not too familiar with a reinstatement credit is where, say for example, a letter of credit is agreed between an applicant and a beneficiary for, let's say, $200,000. But the applicant wishes to control the maximum amount of drawings that can be made at any one time. And says, right, okay, I don't want a drawing of more than $25,000. So the credit is effectively issued for $25,000, but it will have to state that it automatically reinstates to $25,000 after each drawing, subject to a maximum drawing of $200,000. But again, there has to be, what is the basis for that reinstatement? Is it immediately after each shipment, after each drawing is paid? What is the basis? Each of those require that particular pieces of information to be attached to it. Installment drawings or shipments. A lot of banks, and again, I saw one 2 days ago, in relation to a draft wording for what they believed to be an installment drawing or shipment, and it wasn't. What it was 3 separate shipments to be made, but all there was 3 latest shipment dates. It was not an installment drawing or shipment as described in Article 32. They were trying to invoke Article 32, that the credit effectively was dissolved and finished, but they couldn't. They couldn't because what they had was 3 latest shipment dates. In its original structure, that letter of credit allowed for the beneficiary to effectively ship everything within the first latest shipment date. And it all comes down to how you structure and remembering that installment drawings or shipments under Article 32 is effectively, I have a shipment from the 1st of June to the 15th of June. The second shipment is from the 1st of July to the 15th of July. The third shipment is from the 16th of July to the 31st of July. You do that, none of those shipments can be combined. There has to be 3 shipments. And if there's a failure on one of them, the remainder, if any, cease to become available. That's the basis for Article 32 of UCP. The use and application of tolerances under Article 30 of UCP. And effectively, where does the plus or minus 5% come in? Here we're talking about, individual packing units or individual items are not subject to the 5% rule. What we're talking about is 5% plus or minus is where you'll have a description of goods which will be quantified as being a quantity in metric tons, kilograms, barrels of oil, etc., etc. And lastly, standby letters of credit. Standby letters of credit to the extent that although there is the option that standby letters of credit could be issued subject to ISP 98 or UCP. If you want my advice on this one as we're going quickly through this, I think anybody that issues a standby LC subject to UCP is mad. It should always be ISP 98 because those are the rules that actually cover standbys. UCP does not cover standbys in any shape or form. It accommodates them at best. The only reference to standbys is in Article 1 to the effect that it does cover standbys, but it is not geared up to handle standby letters of credit. And if you want maximum protection, then you're talking about ISP 98 and not UCP. When we start talking about the document examination process, we have ISPP 745. Now, if there's one criticism that I have of ISPP 745, and I was the chair of that drafting group, and you may think it unusual that I would be criticizing it, but my criticism is not in the drafting or the content, it's in what's not there. As a drafting group, we went out through all the ICC national committees, almost begging them to give us details of practices that existed in their countries. Because when we talk about international standard banking practice, we are not just talking about things that happen in every country of the world. Something that happens between countries A, B, and C is as much international as something that happens globally. And those were the things that we were trying to encourage banks to provide us with information for. Because, if you look at ISPP 745, there are over 200 paragraphs of practices. If we think about it, that booklet should be twice the size, 3 times the size, because that's the reality of practices that exist. So that is what I mean by saying that, that's my disappointment in ISPP 745, because we can't make up practices. We have to go by what is factual, what is happening, and how people are treating those. And is it that all 3 countries, if there are 3 countries who agree on a practice, are they all in agreement that that is the practice and that is what applies? Because remember, even if it's documented in ISPP 745, it doesn't apply unless you have a transaction that covers that particular issue. So things can be in ISPP 745 that only have relevance in certain parts of the world or in a small cluster of particular countries. So we also have Article 14 of UCP. If you look at 14D, I saw a large number of surveys that banks have conducted over the years, in particular in relation to what is the most common type of discrepancy. And it is not credit expired, it is not late presentation. The number 1 type of discrepancy is conflict of data. So this is a real eye-opener message for beneficiaries. Conflict of data is in your control. It's in nobody else's control. Banks don't dictate what data goes in your documents. You as a beneficiary dictate what data goes in a document. And the more data you put in, the more chance there is of conflict, i.e. different weights, different shipping marks, because data has been rekeyed incorrectly. That's where the discrepancies arise today. And that is easily fixed, but it can only be fixed by beneficiaries paying attention to what is absolutely necessary. What do I need to put in this LC? I come back to my example earlier of the packing list when I said you could have a packing list that says goods covered by my invoice number 1 are packed in container number ABCD 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Now that's a packing list because the credit just said packing list. But even though a credit just said packing list, the likelihood is a beneficiary will give you a long document with a load of detail. But was that what the credit asked for? That's where we get conflict of data. Goods descriptions on documents other than invoices, 14E. 14E says you don't have to have a goods description of any sort, general or one that corresponds on any document other than the invoice. Now here's a big message for banks. If you are in the commodity business, how many of you issue a letter of credit with a goods description that includes the specifications of the goods? Because if you put the specifications of goods in the goods description, you've got it in the wrong place because of 14E. 14E is saying if you also call for a certificate of analysis, 14E is saying that document does not need to have a goods description, which would include the specifications. Those specifications belong with a description relative to a certificate of analysis, an inspection certificate, or that kind of document. I've talked about 14F. So I won't make any further reference to that. 14G, documents presented but not required. Now, okay, that position in UCP is a technical one, but you could have a situation where a document is presented, not required, but a bank cannot ignore it because it includes data which would indicate a sanction breach. So again, beneficiaries have to be careful about what they present and what they don't present. Non-documentary conditions. This is an issuing bank failure. The issuing bank has issued a credit without recognizing that there is a non-documentary condition. You have not supported your customer. You have not provided sufficient backup to your customer to turn a non-documentary condition into a documentary one. Remember, if your customer has put something in their application form, they're expecting something. But if the wording in the credit says no document required, UCP says no document. So who are you protecting? Are you helping the customer? And addresses and contact details of applicant and beneficiary in 14J. Now, the most important word in sub-article 14J is the very first word of that article. When the addresses appear. 14J does not require any address on any document. The credit may, in its terms and conditions, but 14J opens up with when the addresses and contact details of the applicant and beneficiary appear. So remember the word when is very important in relation to anything that you look at. I spoke earlier about to honour or negotiate or to refuse. And that a lot of people get confused regarding the two. And I'm going to come on to that in a moment. What I want to do is skip to the right-hand side and talk about refusals first. If any of you have followed ICC opinions or regularly follow ICC opinions, you will note that there have been over the years many, and I do mean many requests for opinions where banks have issued the wrong type of refusal notice. They've not conformed with Article 16. Article 16 is very simple. As a bank, if you refuse documents, you have to provide 3 elements of data. An indication of refusal, a list of discrepancies, and a status for those documents. In reality, what could be more difficult than just doing that? ICC opinions have said an MT 734 under the SWIFT guidelines is labelled as advice of refusal. Therefore, an MT 734 does not need to state we refuse because it's inherent in the actual message. There's an opinion for that. But you have to list the discrepancies. The discrepancies have to be clear. The discrepancies have to be explicit. By that I mean, and again, there are opinions that say this discrepancy is not explicit enough, therefore can be disregarded. That is the extent of this. If you say invoice not as per LC, to my mind and the ICC's mind, that is not a discrepancy. Discrepancy is waived, finished. The discrepancy is what was wrong with that invoice. What data was wrong? That's the discrepancy. Not a bland statement of invoice not as per LC. That could cover anything. It could cover 20, 30 different items within that invoice. You have to be explicit. If you're not, there are opinions that say this is not explicit enough. This discrepancy can be disregarded. And if that's your only discrepancy, you pay if you're an issuing bank or a confirming bank. That's the penalty. So be very aware of this. Another opinion that was issued last year in relation to this kind of structure, a lot of banks, for whatever reason, issue an MT 799 and then say, please treat this as an MT 734, and then proceed to include the data that you see within this particular example, i.e. the field for discrepancies, the field for disposal of documents, etc. The ICC's opinion that was issued last year is that that's not acceptable. You cannot do that. You have to, if you are issuing a 799, for example, you cannot use the code word hold. You cannot just say disposal of documents hold as you would do in an MT 734. You have to say we are holding documents pending your instructions. You have to do the full text. And that's in an opinion that was issued last year. So you have to follow the opinions. You know, if you look at ISBP 745, they are not invented practices. Probably 90% of what's in, 85, 90% of what's in ISBP are actually shortened versions of ICC opinions. So they've actually gone through the process of review with the ICC Banking Commission. But remember, ISPP 745 was issued or released for publication in 2013. We are now 2020, 7 years later. 7 years later, we have 14 sets of opinions that the ICC have issued, which are not documented in ISPP. But those opinions that have been given have equal value to the content of ISPP 745. Equal value. So you have to keep up with ICC opinions in relation to what you do day to day, and including what may occur if you're due to take the exam next month in the examination itself. So let's get back to honour or negotiate. Honour, payment, acceptance, deferred payment. I actually saw a credit a couple of weeks ago, deferred payment with a draft drawn. You cannot have a draft with deferred payment. The whole idea of deferred payment is you have no draft. So again, it comes down to people understanding, when do I need a draft, when do I not need a draft. You know, the ICC 2 years ago issued a guidance paper regarding drafts, and the message behind that was, you have to start thinking, do I need a draft? And really, out of the 4 settlement terms, payment, acceptance, deferred payment, negotiation, the only product settlement type that needs a draft is acceptance. You know, the UCP, even under UCP 500, talks about negotiation with or without drafts. The fact that a draft is required is not down to an applicant, it's down to each issuing bank and what they put into their letter of credit. I talked about reimbursement on an earlier slide, and I'm only going to talk, because of, in the interest of time, in relation to negotiation. In relation to negotiation, most negotiation LCs are probably issued available at site. The only, and I emphasize only, reimbursement condition that should be issued or provided in a credit that is available by site negotiation is that the issuing bank will reimburse on receipt of documents. There should not be claim reimbursement from XYZ Bank. There should not be debit our account. Those are reimbursement conditions that are relative to a credit available by payment, not by negotiation. And you have to remember that, because as an issuing bank, if you give a reimbursement condition saying debit our account, you're turning a negotiation credit into a payment credit, inadvertently or otherwise. Acting on a nomination to honour or negotiate. This is the right of any nominated bank who has not confirmed the credit. You know, as a nominated bank, if you are the beneficiary and you come to me with your documents, I have probably 4 options. I could say to you, sorry, go away. I don't want to deal with you. I don't deal with that issuing bank anymore. You'll have to deal directly with them. Or I could say, okay, I'll take the documents from you, but I'm not even going to look at them other than for regulatory purposes. But I'll then put a schedule with them and I'll send them to the issuing bank for settlement. I can do the third option. I'll take them in, I'll examine them for you, but I'm not going to act on my nomination. I will not honour or negotiate. And lastly, I will take them from you, I will examine them, and I am willing to act on my nomination. And every nominated bank must remember those 4 stages or attributes that you have in relation to deciding whether or not you are willing to act on a nomination to honour or negotiate. Finally, financing. The thing to remember is that UCP talks about an obligation to pay, to accept a draft, to incur a deferred payment, or to negotiate. There is no obligation to finance. That follows. That's up to each bank to decide upon, whether it be an issuing bank or whether it be a nominated bank. So the fact that a bank has accepted a draft or incurred a deferred payment undertaking does not immediately mean that they have an obligation to finance. That's still in their own domain to make a decision. Now, clearly, if I've accepted a draft, I have an undertaking to pay on a certain date. I may therefore want to maximise my revenue by offering to discount it, but I don't have to. When a credit is available with the nominated bank by acceptance or deferred payment, again here, banks have come unstuck. And if you followed IC opinions, you will have seen this. Banks that have not accepted a draft or have not incurred a deferred payment undertaking have provided financing based on the issuing bank's acceptance of the documents. That is not covered by Article 12B. 12B only provides an authorization to the nominated bank if that nominated bank has accepted a draft that's drawn on it or it has incurred a deferred payment undertaking. It does not cover where an issuing bank has provided a notification that it's accepted the documents. That is not an authorization to provide financing. Similarly, when a bank is not nominated to or negotiate, any financing that is done is outside the purview of the credit and of the UCP. You're on your own, and therefore you may want separate legal agreements between you and the beneficiary to support any financing that you do. Negotiation. Negotiation is to advance or agree to advance. Quite literally, in an unconfirmed credit, the choice is the nominated bank's. As a beneficiary, I could come along and say, I want you to advance me the monies as soon as you find the documents in order. I could say, no, sorry, I'm not willing to do that. I'll agree to advance on the due date, but I'm not willing to give you the money now. That's my choice. As a confirming bank, if you only want to advance on the due date, then that must be part of the terms and conditions of your confirmation. If you say nothing, and the beneficiary comes to you and say, I want the money now, then you are obliged to do so, because that's what you confirm to do. But you could put a caveat to your confirmation. Issues of recourse. These exist clearly where there are unconfirmed LCs, although having said that, I've seen that some confirming banks in the past who've tried to exercise recourse on beneficiaries. Now, the issues of recourse are twofold. One is, on what basis do you exercise recourse? Most banks will exercise recourse on the basis of failure of the issuing bank to provide reimbursement. I think every bank in the world will do that. Because there's an expectation, as an unconfirmed bank, a bank has not confirmed the credit, I've advanced the funds, I expect to be reimbursed, but the issuing bank has failed to do so. It's gone bankrupt, there's a government intervention, whatever. Every bank in the world will do that. The other one is where the documents are discrepant, i.e. the nominated bank did not find discrepancies, but the issuing bank did. On that basis, there is no uniformity. I'll tell you what I did. When I had my element of power in HSBC and in Citibank and ABN, I dictated that under no circumstances, as a nominated bank, if we found the documents in order and the issuing bank found them discrepant, would we exercise recourse? Never. Why? Because that was a reputation thing. If we say we've examined them, we should be comfortable with how we've examined them, and we should not be exercising recourse. We may seek the beneficiaries' support in trying to get the issue resolved, but we would not exercise recourse. But again, there are no rules on this. This comes down to your own bank policy that you have, and you should have your own bank policy. Now, very quickly, the qualification, probably don't need to tell you. There was an addendum issued last year for Incoterms 2020. So if you're looking at the exam for July, you should have already seen that addendum that has been issued. These are the types of issues which are covered within the publication itself. And clearly the examination, I only found out recently that you've been given an extra 15 minutes, which I was for reading time. So you have 3 hours and 15 minutes for the exam. So hopefully a lot of things this morning will help you with your day-to-day activities, as well as if you are taking the examination, some of the things that may crop up. I don't know what's going to be an exam, so I haven't figured my presentation around what is in the exam or not. But a lot of the issues that have been covered this morning are sort of popular topics, should we say, for any examination, whether I set them for anybody or whether LIBF do. I see we have a number of questions, so I'll hand over to Alex for now, and then we'll come back to the questions shortly.
Thanks so much, Gary. Excellent. You can hear me, can you? Yeah, okay. There's been a few people want to be looking at the video, and so I can see there's a few questions. We have recorded this, and the video will be sent out to everybody. Interesting about the number one discrepancy being the conflict of data. Just to let you know, we had at one point have over 400 people joining us, so that's excellent. Just to let you know that Gary's also offered to do a webinar on the 2nd of July. We'll send out details of that, but that's about the common errors for that people make when they're doing the exam, because a number of you will be doing the exam on July the 11th, and those people might want to be interested in the common errors, so we'll be doing a webinar on that. A lot of questions. I think, Gary, some of the questions are like, you're going to be settling a few scores in offices. There's obviously debates going on in a few offices, and you're here to be like the neutral referee. We'll try and get through as many as we can, but there's some really good questions. So the ones that we can't get through, we will come back to you on. I might as well go with a COVID question. There was bound to be one. So this one, destination of the goods is potentially closed or limited due to the COVID pandemic. What banks should consider issuance of LC or deliver the documents to the destination? Does that make sense? So,
looking down,
you get that one, guys. Number 3.
Down the list, there are a couple of questions on the COVID issue. So I can probably do 2 in 1 here. If we look at the question that says destination of the goods is potentially closed or limited due to COVID, what bank should consider issuance of the LC or deliver the documents to the destination? Hopefully by now you have seen the COVID paper that was issued by the ICC on the 6th of April. If not, it's on the ICC's website. And also since then, within the last week, there has been an interpretation paper issued by the ICC in relation to the application of Article 35 of UCP, which talks about banks not having any responsibility or liability for delay. And that paper has made clear that banks have no responsibility for delay in relation to situations where documents are held up, either within their own premises because the courier will not collect, or that they are held with the courier and not being able to be actually delivered. The reality is that in relation to your particular question at issuance, I think if you are aware at the point of issuance that there is still a lockdown and an inability for documents to be delivered to you, you have to start looking at alternative solutions. And those alternative solutions are either delivery to an office that is receiving documentation and has the capability maybe of scanning those documents to you in the meantime so that you can actually complete the process. Or coming up with, and I think this is like a further question that I saw a little bit further down, which is in relation to, is it allowed that during the pandemic where a country locked down and the courier aren't working, then documents sent via email? That's what was proposed by the ICC's COVID paper. But it requires everybody to agree. Everybody has to agree, whether it be the applicant, the issuing bank, the nominating bank, and the beneficiary, how this is going to be put together. If I answer both of those questions altogether, the reality is in the COVID paper, the paper is saying at the end of the day, the issuing bank is the one that gave the instructions regarding delivery of the documents. Therefore, as soon as it knows that documents cannot be delivered to it, it should be looking for alternative solutions. Those alternative solutions relate to places of delivery for the original documents, or an alternative solution in relation to, as the question says here, and as is alluded to in the ICC's COVID paper, that the original documents remain with the nominating bank, but the applicant, issuing bank, and nominating bank all agree that the nominating bank can send scanned or faxed images of those documents to the issuing bank. The issuing bank will examine them, and they will, if they agree the documents comply, they will issue a delivery order for the goods if it's gone by air or by truck, or will issue a shipping guarantee in the meantime, so the applicant can get hold of the goods and the payment can be made under the LC. Because the thing to remember here is all of this cannot stop. It has to keep moving. And the reality is, what you've got to think of is, okay, if today I'm in the middle of a lockdown and we know that the courier is not going to deliver for another 2 weeks, say, that's 2 weeks worth of documents plus everything else that's gone on before that are suddenly going to hit you on a day in the future when that courier service eventually says, I'm going to deliver to you today 400 sets of documents. How are you going to manage those 400 sets of documents within the 5 banking days? Because that hasn't changed. Now, if during the lockdown, you can spread out the examination of those documents over a period of time by examining copies and agreeing as well to make payment and or enable the release of the goods, then clearly that's going to help you in the long run. But there is no obligation to do that. But you should be looking for alternative solutions.
So that then you would say that paper the ICC did was a useful reference document, yeah?
It goes into 4 sections. It covers the interaction between beneficiary and the nominating bank, i.e. the initial presentation. It covers the part at the end, the issuing bank to the applicant, and the bits in the middle between the nominating bank and the issuing bank, and all the scenarios that could occur, where documents are collected but can't be delivered, where they can't be collected and can't be delivered, etc. Okay, do you want me to go through these questions?
Sorry, one thing I've realised, no, hold on, Gary, because I've realised in my, well, Gary, sorry, because of the question, there were so many good questions, I forgot to actually ask the exam question. For each of these webinars, we do the sample exam question. So I don't know if Rox could, we could go back to that. So apologies, there are a lot of very good questions there. Some of them are very technical. It sounds like they've got a specific case. We'll come to that in a second. Just to give you an idea what the questions look like in the exam in the multiple choice. So the quick, you can answer the question and we'll see. So an exporter has agreed to supply machinery to a company on open account terms. Which type of credit could an exporter use to protect against the risk of non-payment? Gary and I might remember some quiz shows from back in the day where the numbers, so this is quite interesting. So an exporter has agreed to supply machinery to a company in opening. What type of credit could an exporter use? So Gary, would you like to answer that one?
The answer is C.
I think the answer is C on standby, but I think what's happened here, it shows a common mistake potentially, or people have, I can see why a lot of people are answering advance payment, but you have to read the question fully, and maybe they would have more time in the exam, they've answered it rather quickly, because the answer is standby.
Standby in the background, waiting in case you have to claim.
So just
because the idea under open account is you afford the applicant the ability to pay under the open account terms and only claim under the standby if they default.
Yeah. So we'll do the next question. Just do 2 questions, but I think that showed a good example of having to read the whole thing properly. And that's why we gave the extra 15 minutes to allow people that. A documentary credit calls for a draft at 60 days after sight. It is available with the issuing bank by acceptance, deferred payment, negotiation, or payment. So people are answering that. At one point today, we had over 400 people, so that was amazing. That's the most we've ever had. So I think, Gary, that people are on the right path here for this one. So well done to those, and this gives you an example of the kind of multiple choice questions that we have, and Gary covered these in his thing. Thank you, Roxanne. So we'll go to the questions again. There was one interesting one I saw earlier, number 2, about the due diligence at the issuance. So you do the due diligence at the issuance, but by the time of maturity of a UCITS LC by the time the UCITS LC matures, the vessel port or any other party may become a sanctioned party What do we do at that time, being an issuance bank or a negotiating bank?
You have to follow
so
the
due diligence playing field
process at every step of the transaction. The reality is, even if you look at it and say, I examined the documents, when I issued the credit, there was no breach. I received the documents and there was no breach. But I refused those documents. 2 weeks have passed and I now have an authorization to pay. I need to look at those documents again and there could now be a breach. That's the reality in which we operate today. Unfortunately, for you guys as banks. I'd like to pick up on one question that somebody's asked, because it's in relation to the 2 questions I answered earlier. It's question number 17 here, which is such an LC has to be under EUCP or UCP? And that's in relation to where we allow documents to be sent by email or by fax. The reality is, for LCs that are already issued and documents exist, it's UCP. If you send documents by email, this is an alternative means of getting this transaction resolved. It is not changing the rules. EUCP will apply if you open your credit subject to EUCP. If you've got documents sitting with a courier company today and they're not going anywhere because of the lockdown, to change the credit to EUCP would require unwinding all of those documents and reissuing them all in electronic form. With that comes problems. How quickly can all of those parties join an electronic platform for that transaction to be concluded? It's not going to happen overnight. You're talking a few weeks minimum for that to happen. So this EUCP is for the new transactions. The ICC COVID paper talks about transactions where paper documents have already been issued. The credit is already subject to UCP. We're not talking about changing the rules. We're talking about facilitating how that transaction can be concluded while the original documents are being held up.
What about number 7? If a good description contains a unit price and there is a tolerance on the value of the LC, does this automatically mean there is a tolerance on the quantity?
The tolerance has to be applied against every factor. Okay. This is a common mistake made by a lot of people. A lot of people will apply the tolerance in 39 plus minus 5%, plus minus 10%, but it does not apply to the quantity unless you put it into the goods description. And it will not apply to the unit price unless you put it into the goods description where that unit price is stated.
And there's a good question above that. We had Dave Manell on last week, and he's done a lot of work on simple LCs, and you've talked a bit about making things simplified. Question is, what is considered bad practice in handling LCs regarding the inclusion of all sorts of protection clauses? We are seeing more of those, aren't we? Banks putting more clauses. Some of them have to be done, but what's your view on that? You've talked a wee bit about it.
Clauses. I think the ICC recently issued an update to their sanction guideline paper because a lot of banks were incorporating language which related to internal bank policies and not to regulatory policies. And that's where it's wrong. If you have an internal policy, then you create a rule around that within your credit. You don't lump it in with the sanction clause. Some banks were saying, we will not honour if these documents breach UN, EU, blah, 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 sanction clauses or our internal policies. Well, unless somebody knows what those internal policies are, no one can examine them. They have to know what they are. It's got to be divulged. People will know what the UN and EU sanction regulations are, who they apply against, and in what respect, but they have no idea what internal policies are.
Yeah, I think we're about to run out of time. We've got only a few seconds. There's a few questions been asked about the CPD points. Just to remind people, for watching this webinar, you'll receive 1 CPD point and you have to put it on your log. we have your names from the registration, so don't worry about that. We're sending out, I believe some people have connectivity problems. Everybody who's registered will be sent a link to this the video. Gary, thanks ever so much. Informative as ever, and credit to you for such a big attendance due to your status in the trade world. I can see you've got a bit of a fan club out there from some of the chats. With your travels to many countries, you've probably met a few of these people over the years, so I'm sure they enjoy seeing your words of wisdom today. Thanks very much, and we say we'll see you again soon. Thanks, you're volunteering to do the one on common errors in the exam. I saw people go, oh well, if you're doing that for CDCS, what about the other ones? Well, at the moment we're only doing it for CDCS, with that exam being soon, but maybe that's something we can do. But for CDCS is the biggest cohort, so we're doing the most amount of people first.
Thanks a lot,
Gary. Thanks ever so much. Have a good day, and have a good day to everybody else. Cheerio.